Well, all right, friends, thanks for being with us. We are in Mark 15 today, kind of the heart of the story. And we are at really the kind of crossroads as we move through chapter 15, which Mark really, Mark didn't make it a chapter, but in this chapter, we have gathered all of the crucifixion and the betrayal, the punishment stories, not the betrayal, I'm sorry, but the Pilate stories and the crucifixion stories. So today we look specifically at that narrative. We start in verse 21. They compelled a passerby who was coming from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him, and they divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. We stop there for a second, Michael. I guess we're not doing that. Yeah, so this character, Simon, makes an appearance in, I believe, 2 of the Gospels. In the other Gospels, I think there is more of a sense in which Jesus either carries his own cross or it's not mentioned. Here, there's a mention that almost gives you the sense that the early church community must have had some connection. The fact that they name his children would seem to further the idea that there's some sort of connectedness to this man, Simon. Otherwise, why name his children? And so the general thought here is that this is probably a person in the wider scope of the early Christian community, and this kind of verifies who they're talking about. And then they bring Jesus to this place, Golgotha. They offer him wine mixed with myrrh, which is kind of a pain deadener. Crucifixion is an extremely agonizing ordeal as one slowly essentially suffocates. And sometimes a person might be offered a very bitter kind of wine. And the idea was that it was a mercy to them. But here, typical of the Gospels, Jesus doesn't do anything that would, he didn't get himself out of this moment. He faced it. And so he faces all of the pain that goes with it. And then there's this reference to dividing his clothes, which Matthew can't avoid pointing out is a fulfillment of the Old Testament. Mark is a little less concerned with what fills the Old Testament prophecies because he's not writing to a particularly Jewish audience. And so we have this part of the story, I think, that everyone pretty much knows. Michael, I don't know if you have anything to add to any of that.
Only a few side things. One thing to note is the church actually throughout time has really fleshed out a lot of this story for all of Mark's economy of words. There's all of the 12 stations of the cross. There's quite a bit of literature and painting and art that's been done recognizing the different sort of movements of this story. And though Mark tells it with a kind of real staccato rapidity, I do think that there's a sense in which each one of these particular characters is a good place to dig in almost a sort of kind of spiritual practice as you're going through this story. Instead of reading this in whole sections like we have, a practice that has been very common throughout the history of the church has been to turn to texts like this and verse by verse slowly sort of consider what Christ is willing to give for us and the different people who are along the journey as he does that. So it's not so much a textual thing, but though this is not long, it is part of the other gospel tellings that has received a lot of time and attention from the church.
Yeah, and just in terms of explaining some of this imagery, the general thought is that the vertical piece of a cross stayed planted in the ground, and that the horizontal piece could be attached and let go. And so a person would maybe be forced to carry that cross beam to the vertical beam and kind of up the hill. Generally, the crucifixions were done in a very public, very observable spot as a warning to others. And so this idea that Jesus has to carry the very instrument that he's going to be executed with, and that becomes an important metaphor to Christians, the idea of carrying your cross, bearing your burdens, really sort of living into that from a spiritual perspective becomes important language to the early church. So continue here with verse 25. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, King of the Jews. And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right, one on his left. Those who passed by derided him. They shook their heads and said, Ah, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross. In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, also mocked him among themselves. And they said, He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe. And those who were crucified with him also taunted him. So again, Mark is showing us this sort of absolute aloneness that Jesus faces, the fact that he's essentially been turned from or turned against by everyone. In Mark, even those who are crucified with him, there's another story in one of the Gospels of one of those men reaching out to Jesus. Mark doesn't tell that version of the story. He tells a version of the story where even the other criminals are ridiculing Jesus. And this idea that, and we see here, I think, the ultimate example of how out of step it is that Jesus as Messiah would suffer. Nobody can get past the idea that the Messiah would never give himself up, that he would save himself, that he would act miraculously, that he would come down off the cross. And all of that is Mark's way, of the Gospel's way, really, of reinforcing this idea that Jesus is Jesus by subjecting himself, not by relieving himself, but by taking upon himself this death and this pain and this punishment. And again, as per Mark, pretty simply told, but a lot of depth.
Yeah, the last question that we find in verse 32 is a significant question. I think in many ways it lies at the heart of this entire gospel. And it is the chief priests and the teachers of the law who are mocking Jesus. And they say, let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. And the question that undergirds that statement is, what do you need to see in order to believe? The question that has really been the very foundational statement of this entire gospel. Mark has been building a case that we might both see and therefore believe. And what we have here are the people who, by all accounts, should have the best sense of who Jesus are, the chief priests, not just the local church pastors, but the head of the entire institution, the entire group of people who are supposed to uphold and continue the worship of the one God. These people stand in front of Jesus and they mock him as the Messiah, the King of the Jews, the one who can't even come down to save the people. And what they don't realize is that Jesus is literally in the act of saving them. That this very thing that he's doing right now is the exact thing that was promised that the Messiah would do. But of course, as we've talked about many times already in this Bible study, their own assumptions, their own expectations about would be, that stands in the way of who Jesus actually is. But once again, I think we should not rush past that. They are literally seeing God's salvific work for the world, and they do not believe. And so the question that comes to every reader of this gospel is, do we believe the account that we have not seen with our physical eyes? And that is really the question of faith. And ultimately, what we decide will be the determiner of the steps that we'll take in our own lives.
Yeah, and a couple of, I think, helpful details here. We mentioned yesterday that the phrase "King of the Jews," which we've not seen, becomes very important in this narrative. I think we saw it 2 or 3 times yesterday. We see it again today, along with the phrase "the King of Israel." The second thing that I think is interesting is that Mark goes out of his way to tell us that the 2 men crucified with Jesus are bandits. You might remember this is the exact word used of Barabbas, who was set free. So again, Jesus being identified with these, the very men who seek to overthrow power. It is their desire to attack Rome, to attack the structures, to do harm that has gotten them to where they are. And Jesus is now considered in that company, but we know from the backstory that Mark tells us that he is the incredible exception to the rule. He is on the cross through no wrongdoing, through no inclination toward violence, through no political maneuvering. He is on the cross as a result of those in power being offended by him, those in power being threatened by him. And it's a very different kind of threat. And it's interesting that Mark goes out of his way to tell us that detail.
Yeah, and Mark is similar to the other gospel writers in this aspect, that what you find in this is the core of the crucifixion narrative. And notice how little detail Mark includes. I think the modern church, and to some extent this is modeled, throughout church history, but I think we, maybe because crucifixion is so far from our imaginations, we maybe spend more time imagining the horrendousness of this moment, the physicality of it, the brutality of it. But Mark here really gives no description to the monumentally painful aspect of this entire ordeal. And some of that has got to be connected to the fact that Mark, throughout this entire gospel, has been showing us that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that he is beyond all. He has the authority, he has the power, he has the persistence, the perseverance, the wisdom. And so even in crucifixion is not the focus. Jesus is the focus. It's not what's happening to him, but it's what he's determined to do through and because of it. And that's the amazing turn of the gospel that I think can so easily be lost on us, is that it's always about the reversal. It's always about the thing that you expect to happen not happening, and in fact the reverse being the thing that's true. So we expect that crucifixion is the end of this person, but rather crucifixion is the validation and effective act of God working to save the world. So what appears to be weakness is actually strength, and you see that time and time and time again. But I think it's striking. We have movies and books and lots of things that have been made depicting crucifixion, and ironically the gospels themselves spend really no time teasing out what that process is, and are far more interested in putting the light directly on Jesus and what he's doing in this process.
It's a really interesting point, Michael. One of the things I think is incredibly hard for us in our culture to wrap our head around is that this thing that happens in public. The crowds are there. There are people yelling at Jesus. There are people observing this. That this happens in a public spot. Children would have walked past this place. Bodies would have been displayed at times. The idea of someone who stands against power being punished would have been a common sight for the people of Jesus' day. This isn't done in a closed room like an execution in our day and time. This isn't done. This is done out in the open. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. There are people moving around, and there's a sense in which I think that helps to understand the context of the cross and how the early church, who had to walk under the shadow of that threat, they had to walk under the implication that the power of Rome, that the power of the religious leaders could threaten them, could at any moment break into their lives in a destructive way. And here you have instead the early church clinging to the idea that this one who went to the cross stands above that, that he overthrows that, and that he is able to overturn the shame and the sort of horrific nature of that very event.
Yeah, I think, I don't want to rush ahead, so I'm going to sort of restrain myself here. The next section that we're going to turn to tomorrow is the beating heart of this gospel. In fact, it's hard to not have mentioned what's about to happen throughout this entire book. It's actually, to be honest with you, I already find myself doing it, rushing ahead here, but it's one of those things where once it happens, it transforms everything that is before it. And so that's going to come. Don't miss tomorrow. The point in saying this is, though, that in many ways, the crucifixion of Jesus, I think, is the ultimate depiction of a human thing that has eternal godlike significance. And this happens in the Passover with what we celebrate in the Lord's Supper. It happens at baptism, that idea of water. But here, I think you say it really well, Clint, the idea that this is a physical thing that people in that time and place would associate with not every day, but it's certainly not something that would draw your attention away as being uncommon. And so the reality that God is able to use this thing, which to us is fantastical, but to them is another aspect of broken humanness. God is able to use that broken humanness to God's end, is the ultimate depiction of God's authority, power, and ability. And that's what makes the early Christians so strong in the face of adversity, is the fact that they believe in this God who can bring power into their weakness, a God who can stand up even during and in the midst of persecution, that God can make us strong in and through it. I just think there's something unbelievably spiritual and beautiful in that we are too quick to pass by, to rush through in a reading of the gospel.
Yeah, I don't want to make it morbid, but we see the cross and we celebrate it because for us it is a sign of victory. In Jesus' day, in the early church, the cross would have been the ultimate sign of the authority of power, to the threat of getting sideways with those in power, getting stripped naked, beaten, and hung up for hours on end until you died while people watched and commented. That's a horrific reality of the weakness that they have. And if we understand that, then I think we see it also as the ultimate example of the reversal in this gospel, right? Mark has been talking about the least will be first, the least will be great, the last will be first. Here we have that highest thing representing the power and the brokenness and the cruelty of the world now being used as the very symbol of the one who conquered all of that. And we don't want to get ahead of the story, but I think maybe we see that most clearly through tomorrow's text.
Well, I think, friends, that's what we have for today. Do come back tomorrow. I cannot emphasize how significant tomorrow's conversation will be, and we look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.